In October 1824, the military wing of the East India Company suffered a public defeat. Its soldiers retreated in a panicked scramble, abandoning their positions and their equipment to the smoke of the battlefield. The force that broke them came from Kittur, a small kingdom in southern India. Its economy was built on the trade of chili peppers and spices, rather than the maintenance of a large professional army. The victory was led by a local queen, Chennamma. Her role in this conflict was eventually overshadowed by later uprisings, but the events of 1824 were determined by her specific military training and an act of internal sabotage that followed. Until this battle, the East India Company relied on a reputation for absolute invincibility to maintain control. Kittur provided the first physical evidence that their lines could be broken. By the early 1800s, the East India Company was systematically absorbing independent territories across the subcontinent. Under the Doctrine of Lapse, if a ruler died without a biological heir, the company nullified adopted successors and seized the territory. When Kittur's king died, leaving adopted heir Shivalingappa, British collector Thackeray refused the boy, demanding the state treasury keys. Queen Chennamma refused. She sent a formal letter to the British stating that the right to choose a successor belonged to the people and the royal family of Kittur, not a foreign corporation. Thackeray viewed the kingdom as a corporate asset on a ledger. By assuming the state would surrender to an administrative order, he walked into a confrontation his forces were not prepared to win. In October 1824, Thackeray marched his army to the gates of the Kittur fort, expecting a peaceful transfer of the state's wealth. He was met by a ruler with a rigorous military background. Chennamma was trained in the traditions of the Limbangap community, having mastered sword fighting, archery, and cavalry tactics from a young age. The fort doors burst open. Chennamma personally led a cavalry charge into the British lines, supported by her lead commanders and a localized force of defenders. The British lines collapsed immediately. During the melee, Thackeray was shot and killed by a Kittur gunner, leaving the company's forces without a commander. The Queen's forces captured 2 senior British officers. After obtaining a promise that Kittur's independence would be respected, Chennamma released them as a gesture of statecraft. Chennamma operated under the assumption that the company would honor the agreement. She had not yet accounted for the fact that the British response to a public defeat would be a total military escalation. In December, Commissioner Chaplin arrived at the head of a massive coalition army. He brought in heavy artillery units and thousands of troops from the Bombay and Madras presidencies. Even against these odds, the defenders of Kittur held their positions. They successfully defended the walls against the initial siege. When the British failed to take the fort by force, they turned to internal sabotage. They approached 2 of the Queen's ministers, Mallappa Shetty and Venkatappa, to undermine the defense from within. In the middle of the night, the traitors accessed the armory. They contaminated the kingdom's gunpowder supply by mixing it with water, mud, and raw ragi millet, rendering the ammunition useless. When the next assault began, Kittur's cannons were silent. The British artillery blew apart the walls, and the fort was overrun. Queen Chennamma was captured and taken into custody. The British victory was secured through payment and espionage. Their heavy artillery only succeeded after their agents had neutralized the Queen's ability to fire back. Chennamma was imprisoned in the Bailhungal fort. The British officials closed their files on Kittur, believing the rebellion had been settled. They were immediately challenged by Sangolli Rayanna, the Queen's lead commander. He launched a campaign of guerrilla war, using small, mobile units to strike at British infrastructure. Rayanna's forces burned government offices and seized British funds to sustain the movement, keeping the memory of the Queen's cause alive across the region. The insurgency ended in tragedy. Rayanna was eventually caught through another act of betrayal and was executed in 1831. Chennamma remained in captivity until her death in 1829. The British managed to dismantle the military resistance, but by imprisoning the Queen and executing her commander, they turned 2 local leaders into a permanent symbol that the East India Company could be challenged. In modern India, the attempt to erase the history of Kittur has failed. In 2007, a bronze statue of Queen Chennamma was installed within the Indian Parliament complex. Former President Pratibha Patil presided over the ceremony, recognizing her as the nation's first female freedom fighter. Her story survived the British Empire itself, preserved for generations through the Gigi Pada folk songs and the annual Kittur Utsava celebrations. Chennamma's rebellion occurred 30 years before the major uprisings of 1857. She proved that the company's control was not absolute, establishing a precedent for resistance that outlived her reign and her life.